Hi, I'm Will Saris. I'm an actor and YouTube host who's always been interested in the intersection between history and entertainment. And what better person to embody that than P.T. Barnum? Welcome to Who is Barnum to You, a lively discussion that celebrates personal connections, insights, and inspirations drawn from Barnum's life based on fact, fiction, fun, or just plain imagination and nostalgia. Today, we're going to be talking to Bruce Hawley, who has a unique connection to P.T. Barnum. He is related to him. So Bruce, thank you for joining us. You have a really interesting connection to P.T. Barnum. Tell me about your connection.
Well, Phineas and I are cousins.
Okay.
To be specific, we're fourth cousins, 6 times removed, but we are cousins. We have a common ancestor. His third great-grandfather was Thomas Barnum. Thomas was my 9th great-grandfather.
Wow.
So I have, I guess, some of his DNA in me. And that's my main connection to him, is through blood, essentially.
And now you have another connection to him also.
I do.
So tell me about that one.
Well, as we all know, Barnum spent the last 20 years of his life in the circus business. And another one of my great-grandfathers, Edwin Noble, worked for Barnum in the winter quarters in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And he was a wheelwright, made the wagon wheels for all of these circus wagons, some of which you see here. And he worked there from 1896 to about 1910 in that time frame. In fact, I brought some of his tools, if you'd be interested.
I would love to see them.
You know, and this is an interesting tool. As a wheelwright, naturally you have to take the nut off the wagon wheel in order to work on the wheel. And this very heavy wrench, which is pretty solid, weighs probably about 10, 12 pounds, was used to do that. And an interesting story about the wagon wheel nuts is that you hear the expression when people are talking about business, about did you make your nut? And where that comes from is from the circus world. Because in the early part of the 20th century and before, you know, circuses traveled overland with wagons. And when they came to town, the local merchants, the creditors, they had to pay for feed and food and whatever. They took the nuts off the front wagon wheels. So they couldn't leave town until they made their nut to pay back the merchants for the food and whatever, to put the nuts back on the wagon wheels so they could move on. So this wrench was part of that process of making the nut. And, you know, as we all know, wagon wheels, wagons have a turning feature. They call it the fifth wheel. And this tool, which is a very large screwdriver, was used to reach inside to loosen the screw that held that. And again, these were my great-grandfather's tools. And then this is a spoke shave. Okay,
so what does that do?
They made the spokes by hand. They
wow.
Shaved. Because if you look at a spoke on a wagon wheel, it's shaved.
It's got like the...
It's shaved and it comes down. So my connections there, are through blood, obviously, but also because of my great-grandfather. And I grew up in this area, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, is where I was born. And the winter quarters was here. And for a great part of almost 50 years, the Barnum and Bailey, and then later Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey winter quarters was right here. And this was a hub of circus activity, not only for all of the circus people that you know of, but Buffalo Bill was here. He winter quartered here, as well as Annie Oakley and others too. So this was a very important place, and people who grew up in this area had these connections to Barnum.
It's so interesting because Bridgeport, in a lot of ways, came on a lot of hard times. In the last 30, 40 years. And it's so interesting to realize that it was such a hub of activity, and really like a center of manufacturing, a center of, obviously Barnum and the winter quarters were here. It was a major city that, is now, I think, coming back. And hopefully the Barnum Museum is part of that.
Well, absolutely. And quite candidly, Barnum was a big part of the success of Bridgeport. We think of him as a circus person, but he was an industrialist. He was responsible for building a factory here. He was a tremendous philanthropist. He gave money to create parks, Seaside Park and Washington Square on the east side of Bridgeport, where all, through his development, land development, he was the mayor of Bridgeport.
Yeah.
So he was a big part of Bridgeport's success, during that period in the building of that whole time in Bridgeport.
What's the inspiration that you've had from learning about Barnum?
Well, Barnum for me, and maybe it's just because it's part of my DNA, inspires me in many ways. And I think of an acronym, and I was in the military, so acronyms are a big deal in the military. I think of the acronym COPIE. The C is creativity. This guy was creative. He came up with ideas that were relevant and responsive to what people wanted at that time. O was for optimism. He had unbelievable challenges in his life. He lost his wife, he lost his daughter. Many of his museums burned to the ground. The winter quarters burned to the ground. He was attacked because of his beliefs on things. He operated during the Civil War when the country was in a mess. And somehow, with his optimism and his creativity, he survived. And we're still talking about him 130 years after he died. So that says something about this guy, right? The P, I think of him as giving back. And part of the DNA is that you're successful, you do something, and then you give back. He gave the city of Bridgeport a seaside park. Hundreds of acres, beautiful land on the water.
Oh, yeah.
He hired Olmsted, who was the designer of Central Park, the landscape architect, to design the park first class, right? And he was involved in the Bridgeport Hospital, which is now part of Yale New Haven's hospital system. He was involved in a Port Jefferson Ferry Company, many, many things that he gave back in his philanthropy. And most importantly, we're sitting in his last gift, the Barnum Museum.
Yeah.
And in his will, he left money to build this museum. And in his creativity and his intelligence, he designed this museum that the first floor was going to be for retail. So if you look at the windows around, it was going to be a storefront.
Right.
But they'd have a tenant. And he knew a museum would be kind of a nonprofit operation, right? But he had the tenant selling clothes or whatever it was to pay for the museum, which was on the upper floors. So even in the design, it had a sustainable life, right?
Right.
And again, we're still sitting here 130 years after he died. The I stands for his intelligence and his industriousness. This guy was smart.
Yeah.
He really was. He had the ability to come up with a solution quickly to overcome all these problems that he had and make something that is sustainable. And that's, you go through life, we all live on this earth for lucky 100 years, but that's a short time. But to do something that people will benefit from. And of course, he was focused on entertainment. He's the father of entertainment, no question about that. But also in many ways, the father of education, higher education, let's put it that way. He left things to Tufts University, to Yale, to various other museums. And of course, his American Museum was all about education, bringing interesting people and interesting artifacts to teach the masses in a way that was successful. And, the E is his energy. He had boundless energy. Here's a guy that he was knocked down, he came back up. Yeah. And he lived to be, 80 years old, 81. And in that period, not too many people made it to 81.
Right.
And he really didn't get involved in the circus world until he was 61,
Yeah, it was a retirement project.
It was his retirement project. Knowing circus people, that is the spirit of circus people. The show must go on is a real deal. That's the real deal. And as we're talking about that right now in the middle of this pandemic, we're seeing that. He had this optimism, energy, industriousness, all these things. He did make a difference. He made a difference to our country and to the world because he truly, he toured Europe several times with Lavinia Warren, Tom Thumb, Jenny Lind, so on and so forth. He really did have an impact on history.
Is there anything else that you want to tell us about or talk to us about?
I do think that it's important for people to look at history, to see where things are. we're going through tough times right now, and so many families are being disrupted, all generations, careers, and whatever. And but you know what? We've gone through this before. Whether it was world wars, whether it was the pandemic in 1918, which the circus was affected by that, but everything. And by looking at history, by looking at people in the past who were successful, who navigated through tough times, I think that gives you hope, and it gives you some ideas. And so, to the extent that we can encourage people, all generations, to look at history, to help them through their daily lives, I think that's a wonderful thing.
Thank you very much for sitting down
You're
with us.
welcome.
Who is Barnum to You is produced and directed by Rui Pino, Tom Victor, and Will Saris, with thanks to Stephen Cardone. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Barnum Museum channel. That helps the museum out a lot. Click on that thumbs up and leave a comment down below if you enjoyed the video, or if you want to make a suggestion for a future show. And if you can make a charitable donation to the Barnum Museum, please do so. That helps us bring you new episodes. All the links are in the description. Don't forget, the noblest art is that of making others happy. See you real soon.